Hey everybody, this is a piece titled Russian Imperialism and Stalinism from the Workers' Party. Piece is from The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Lost Texts of Critical Marxism, edited by Sean Matgamna, in a section titled The New Russian Empire. There's a little introduction to the section as a whole, which is only a paragraph long, so I'm going to read that before I read the actual piece. In the 1940s, the USSR emerged as the world's second superpower, and if we measure by direct political control in Eastern Europe and Asia rather than by economic clout, the world's greatest empire holder. Stalinist states with some autonomy from Moscow also emerged in Yugoslavia and China. The provisional hypothesis advanced by Max Shachtman and others in the Workers' Party debates of 1940 to 41 that the Stalinist bureaucracy was not a new predatory ruling class, but a freakish and anomalous one, unlikely to be replicated outside the USSR, had to be revised. The text in this chapter presents a pioneering analysis of Stalinism as a substantial, though by no means stable and invincible, force in world history. Okay, so that's the introduction to the section. And now it's time for the piece, which originally appeared, in a footnote, it says, originally appeared in New International, April 1947, from a resolution adopted by the Workers' Party at the Workers' Party's 1946 convention. Again, it's titled Russian Imperialism and Stalinism. At the very outset of the war, the founders of the Workers' Party, in opposing the war as imperialist on both sides, set forth the position that Russia's role in the war was imperialist too, and that in two senses. One, that she was participating as an integral part of the imperialist war, and two, that she was pursuing imperialist aims of her own. Hence the slogan of, quote, unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, end quote, was outlived, had become reactionary, and could only serve the ends of Stalinist imperialism. If this question could be seriously debated among Marxists in 1939 to 1940, it is no longer possible to do so today. The position of our party has been confirmed to the very hilt. The proponents of support of Russia in the war, prompted though they were by revolutionary proletarian considerations, nevertheless capitulated objectively to Stalinist imperialism and helped to cover its deception and enslavement of other nations and peoples with radical arguments. Stalinist Russia today is a full-grown imperialist power. The sway of the reactionary ruling class in Russia extends over a dozen other lands and over tens of millions of other peoples. These peoples have been deprived of their elementary democratic right to national independence and self-government and reduced to the slavery imposed by bureaucratic collectivism. Along with this right have disappeared all their other rights. For the first victim of the victory of Stalinism is the working class, its democratic organizations and rights. More accurately, the very first victim of Stalinism is the revolutionary vanguard of the working class. Revolutionary socialism does not recognize the right of any nation or people or class to deprive any other nation, people, or class of these elementary rights except in the higher interest of democracy, as in the period of the great bourgeois revolutions, or in the higher interest of socialism, as in the period of the proletarian revolutions. In the case of bureaucratic collectivist Russia, the peoples of the Baltic and the Balkans, of Romania and Yugoslavia and Bulgaria, of Poland and East Prussia, of sections of Asia and the Middle East have been thus disfranchised in the interest of Stalinist slavery and of the consolidation of the Stalinist bureaucracy. They have been enslaved as loot and booty of the struggle for the imperialist domination of the world. The revolutionist loses title to his name who does not protest and fight against this enslavement. The claim that this, quote, expansion, end quote, i.e. imperialist aggression and annexation, is required, quote, merely for the, quote, security of Russia is a classical imperialist sophism. The defense of the frontiers of a nation, whether by purely defensive measures or by offensive measures, is actually of no importance, is warranted only if it is fighting to acquire or maintain or extend democracy or socialism. Quote, security, end quote, by annexation to a nation which is itself ruled by a reactionary class which tramples democracy and socialism underfoot, more ruthlessly than anywhere else in the world, and enslaves every other people over whom it extends its dominion, is nothing but a euphemism and justification of imperialist oppression and exploitation. Every nation has the right to be ruled by its own people, even if they choose a reactionary regime without unwarranted interference by another nation. On the other hand, every nation has the right to come to the aid of another people which is fighting to overturn its own tyrannical regime, provided the assistance is not aimed at replacing the old tyranny with another and thereby strengthening reaction as a whole. The basic socialist principle observed by the revolutionary worker state of Lenin and Trotsky and proclaimed by it is applicable in judging the policy not only of the imperialism of capitalist states, but as well as the imperialism of the Stalinist state. The social sources of Stalinist imperialism have already been examined scientifically by the revolutionary Marxists. It is necessary to continue this examination with the greatest scientific objectivity, without prejudices, and through to the very end. It is not necessary, however, to wait until the last word has been uttered on this question in the scientific sphere before arriving at a judgment of Stalinist imperialism, as it has already insufficiently manifested itself, or before adopting a political position towards it. If bureaucratic collectivism survives in Russia until the next war, the Stalinist state will enter the war on the same basis as its principal rival, for the purpose of defending its imperialist conquest and its reactionary rule at home, for the purpose of extending these imperialist conquest and this rule, for the purpose of winning the struggle for the domination of the globe. Whatever the abstract or historically remote possibilities may be, all the present indications, the whole present trend, show that the Third World War, if it is allowed to come, will be a struggle between the two monster imperialisms for world mastery, and consequently, a struggle that would decide the fate of the world for an indefinite period of time. Under such circumstances, it is impossible for the revolutionary Marxists to speak in any way of, quote, defense of the Soviet Union, end quote. The resolution on the Russian question adopted by our party in 1941 deliberately, quote, left the door open, end quote, with regard to the possibility of again raising the slogan of defense of Russia, not in the Second World War, but in a conceivable later war. The party took the view that in examining a new social phenomenon that was still in the early process of formation, namely bureaucratic collectivism, and without positive foreknowledge of the political face of the world in the post-war period, it did not have the right as a scientific Marxian organization to set forth its position categorically on all aspects of the question of Stalinism and for all time. Indeed, even now, the party does not lay claim to a position which applies forever and under all conceivable circumstances, but, quote, all conceivable circumstances, end quote, is an abstraction which has its, quote, rights, end quote, on the plane of abstraction. What is before us concretely is the development of Stalinist Russia as a full-fledged reactionary empire, oppressing and exploiting not only the Russian people, but a dozen other peoples and nations, and that in the most cruel and barbarous way. What is before us concretely is the overwhelming probability of the next world war, being fought between two reactionary imperialist powers for the preservation and extension of their empires. In face of this reality, the Workers' Party declares flatly that all talk of defense of Russian imperialism or of American imperialism in the war, or in the period of preparation for that war, which we are now living through, is reactionary talk and signifies an abandonment of the principles and interests of the proletariat and of socialism. The concretization of our party's position on the slogan of, quote, defense of the Soviet Union, end quote, must be accompanied by an important correction in its resolution on Russia. The resolution, which has otherwise been confirmed so emphatically, contains an error. It declares that in the absence of a proletarian revolution, Stalinist Russia after the war, quote, cannot in all likelihood escape integration into the capitalist system as a colony or a series of colonies of imperialism, end quote. It adds that the stages of development that will be passed, quote, before bureaucratic collectivism in Russia is destroyed, either by the proletarian revolution or capitalist counter-revolution, cannot be established categorically in advance, end quote. The end of the war has shown, however, that although capitalism has not been destroyed by the proletariat, bureaucratic collectivism in Russia has not only not been integrated into the capitalist system, but has not only not been overturned, but has survived and expanded. The provisional forecast of the party's resolution was an error exactly to the extent to which it represented a hangover of the theory rejected by the party, namely the theory that Russia is a, quote, degenerated workers' state, end quote, which could not survive the war. Fortunately, this error was not seriously reflected in the current analyses of the party during the war, nor did it affect the political line of the party. Its struggle against the war, against Stalinism and Stalinist imperialism, for socialism, or its struggle on the theoretical and political planes against the theoreticians of the, quote, workers' state, end quote. Stalinist imperialism is unique in that, among other things, it has at its disposal a, quote, native, end quote, mass movement in all other countries, the, quote, communist parties, end quote, and their affiliates. If one major section of the labor movement, the social democracy, is more and more an agency of American imperialist democracy, the other major section, the Communist parties, is outrightly the agency of Stalinist imperialism. The theory that the Stalinist parties, like the traditional reformist organizations, are agents of the capitalist class, that they, quote, capitulate to the bourgeoisie, end quote, is fundamentally false. They are the agencies of Russian bureaucratic collectivism. To the extent that they serve the bourgeoisie of the capitalist countries, it is only as agents of the Kremlin who are temporarily hired out for service to the bourgeoisie of this or that country, but only in the given interests of the Stalinist state, of its diplomatic maneuvers, of its imperialist objectives. The old communist parties in the days of the opportunist leadership of the Comintern did tend to conciliate the bourgeoisie and to capitulate to it under stress. The present Stalinist movement has nothing but the name in common with these old parties. It serves today a strong imperialist master. In the interest of this master, it is capable of the most irreconcilable opposition to its, quote, own, end quote, capitalist class and to its rule. It is imperative to understand this, for otherwise the whole struggle against Stalinism is falsified or nullified. If this is not understood, Stalinism stands to gain by being subjected only to attacks which are aimed at what Stalinism is not, instead of attacks aimed at what it is and at those points where it is really vulnerable. Stalinism is not, however, merely the servant of Russian imperialism. If this were the only role Stalinism played, the tenacity and, quote, durability, end quote, of the Stalinist bureaucracy in the capitalist countries could not be adequately explained. This bureaucracy is not prompted exclusively or even primarily by such, quote, idealistic, end quote, considerations as the preservation and consolidation of the Russian state bureaucracy. It has a material base of its own and its own social ambitions in every country. The Stalinist parties are fundamentally different from all the traditional working class parties, not only from those that are revolutionary socialist in character, but also from those that are reformist, centrist, or anarchist. The Stalinist parties are the parties of bureaucratic collectivism. As Trotsky set it forth in his ultimate judgment of the Stalinist bureaucracy, it seeks to establish in every capitalist country in which it functions the same social and political regime as prevails in Russia today. The material basis of the Stalinist bureaucracies is provided by the deepening disintegration and decay of capitalism. The social development, the reformist, the old trade union bureaucracy rose and developed on the basis of the upswing of capitalist economy. In that period, a pro-capitalist labor bureaucracy was created. This reformist sector of the labor movement became tied to capitalist democracy. It was nurtured economically by the concessions which capitalism could still afford to give, and it received a satisfying political status from the prosperous bourgeoisie and its democracy. However, as capitalism decays and is racked by agonizing crises, it can less and less afford economic or political concessions to the working class in general, or to the reformist bureaucracy in particular. The material basis of reformism is narrowed both in the economic and political spheres. Reformism does not break its ties with capitalist democracy, but decaying capitalism breaks its ties with reformism. As capitalism decays and narrows the basis for existence of reformism, the bonds linking the whole strata of the population to the foundations of capitalism, private property, are loosened. To maintain private property, which means nowadays to preserve the increasingly centralized and concentrated power of monopoly capitalism, requires the economic and political disfranchisement. The economic and political degradation, not only of the proletariat, but also of the middle and intermediate classes and social strata, peasants, small producers and manufacturers, small traders, professionals, civil servants, scientists, labor bureaucracies, industrial managers and supervisors, etc., etc. Fascism appeals to all these strata with a socially demagogical program of, quote, anti-capitalism, end quote, but with the social aim of maintaining precisely that form of capitalist ownership which is disfranchising, degrading, and declassing the social strata to which fascism appeals. Stalinism, on the other hand, while appealing to the same strata with a no less demagogical program of, quote, socialism, end quote, nevertheless aims at removing from power that class, the monopoly capitalists, which stands in the way of the acquisition of social power by the Stalinist bureaucracy. In this sense, too, fascism and Stalinism, while not identical, are, quote, symmetrical phenomena, end quote. Stalinism has a grip on the minds of the working class, not only by virtue of its usurpation of the socialist traditions of the Bolshevik Revolution. It seeks and often gains support of the working classes because, while its anti-proletarian and anti-socialist nature is not immediately clear, its anti-capitalist nature is apparent. It cannot be considered an accident that the Stalinist bureaucracy attracts to its ranks, especially in countries where the decay of capitalism has reached an advanced stage, many of the former and reformist bureaucrats whom capitalism no longer offers economic or political security. The expropriation of the bourgeoisie by the democratic proletariat means the beginning of the end of all bureaucratism and bureaucratic privilege. But the seizure of all social power by Stalinism means the legal and police sanctification of bureaucratic privilege and power. It is likewise no accident that Stalinism attracts to itself also such elements as the declassed worker, the disoriented and demoralized petty bourgeois intellectuals and professionals whom capitalism allows an ever-narrowing base for existence, but whom the triumph of Stalinism offers exceptional privileges and social status. The growth and triumph of the Stalinist bureaucracy means neither the victory nor the advancement of socialism and the proletariat. It means the establishment of the totalitarian tyranny known as bureaucratic collectivism. Such a tyranny is possible only in the absence of a socialist perspective, inasmuch as the socialist perspective depends, in our period, on the ability of the revolutionary Marxists to establish a party able to place itself at the head of the working class and all other little people. The triumph of Stalinism is possible only under the condition of the absence of such a party. Conversely, it is impossible in the presence of such a party, since all the other conditions for the victory of the socialist proletariat have matured to the highest degree under capitalism. Excuse me. The question of the perspective of Stalinism cannot therefore be resolved in a purely theoretical way. It can be resolved only in struggle. Every advance of Stalinism is not only a defeat for democracy, but also a defeat for the proletariat and for socialism. Unlike reformism, Stalinism does not aim at the preservation of bourgeois democracy, let alone at the conquest of proletarian democracy. Stalinism is neither a democratic nor a socialist movement, but a bureaucratic totalitarian collectivist movement, which must be resisted by the organized proletariat at every turn. The traditional policy of the revolutionary vanguard towards the labor reformist movements or bureaucracies does not, therefore, apply to the Stalinist movements. Given its inability to lead the proletariat directly and in its own name, the revolutionary vanguard is prepared as always to give critical support to the reformist bureaucracies in their conflicts with the capitalist class. This makes possible, at least to some extent, the defense of the economic and political integrity of the working class and its movement, or even the defense of bourgeois democracy against fascism, i.e. the defense of the political conditions that are more favorable to the existence and development of the working class. The same policy cannot be applied to Stalinism, since it is neither a democratic nor a socialist movement and has neither democratic nor socialist aims. The revolutionary Marxists, therefore, maintain the general rule of no support of Stalinism of any kind, and of irreconcilable opposition to any move calculated to strengthen Stalinism's position. Whether or not Stalinism can triumph in the capitalist world cannot be decided absolutely in advance. To repeat is a question of struggle. Up to now it is established that Stalinism was able to triumph by overturning the rule of the proletariat. In Russia, it was able to triumph in the Baltic countries annexed to Russia, but only by virtue of the military force of Russian imperialism. In Poland and Yugoslavia, the Stalinist bureaucracy has taken power, in clear refutation of the analysis that it represents a, quote, capitalist, end quote, force. The bureaucracy has not only disenfranchised and enslaved the proletariat and peasantry, but has systematically expropriated the bourgeoisie and the landlords and converted their property into state property. This phenomenon gives the final blow to the theory that Russia is a, quote, workers' state, end quote, because property is nationalized, but does not establish the conclusion that Stalinist collectivism is guaranteed to replace capitalism in the world. Both in Poland and Yugoslavia, Stalinism came to power under exceptional circumstances, namely in the absence of any organized bourgeoisie to speak of and by means of the direct and decisive aid of the armed forces of Russian imperialism. Nowhere has Stalinism shown its social ability to crush a free working class, or more important, its ability to overthrow the rule of the capitalist class. The countries in which it has triumphed are lands where the bourgeoisie was weak to begin with and where feudal remnants were thickly intertwined with capitalist relationships. Nowhere has Stalinism shown its social ability to overturn the rule of the capitalist class in a modern advanced capitalist country. Hence our denial and rejection of the theory of the, quote, Stalinist epoch, end quote, our reaffirmation of the theory that Stalinist bureaucratic collectivism represents a mongrel social formation, and our reaffirmation of the concept that this is the epoch of the proletarian socialist revolution, which will sweep away capitalism and bureaucratic collectivism alike. New section: Germany and Eastern Europe. Nowhere did the pre-war perspectives of the Fourth International stand in sharper contrast to the political reality produced by the war than in Germany. Yet there was still reason to assign the German proletariat a pivotal role in the strategy of the European Revolution up to Hitler's triumph in 1933, the successful mobilization of the German nation in 1939 without internal disturbances, the paralysis of the German proletariat during the Nazi conquest and subjugation of the continent, and the absence of any repercussions within Germany to the military setbacks beginning at Stalingrad in the winter of 1942-43, proved the need to re-examine the analysis that designated Germany the, quote, key to the international situation, end quote. A refusal to do the latter was only possible on the part of those who, as with the leadership of the Socialist Workers' Party, stubbornly denied that the fascist conquest of Europe had hurled back the proletariat in terms of consciousness and organization. Those who insisted that fascism had taught the proletariat the lessons of revolutionary politics and that, consequently, it would emerge from the fascist oppression at a higher political level than before, could not but assign to the German proletariat the vanguard role in the European Revolution. The colossal blunder of continuing to view the German proletariat in terms of 1918 to 1933 was an inseparable part of the totally false position which rejected the slogan of national liberation, which led to abstention from participation in the resistance movements, which foresaw the overthrow of Hitler as the proletarian revolution, and which poses the main slogan, quote, the United Socialist States of Europe, end quote. Basing themselves upon this completely unreal analysis, its authors momentarily expected, with amazing credulity and increasing desperation, the outbreak of the proletarian revolution as an automatic result of Germany's growing military catastrophes in 1944-45. This gross misreading of the situation in Germany revealed that its perpetrators sadly lacked even an understanding of the mechanics of the proletarian revolution and conceived of it in terms of the sheerest automatism and spontaneity. The defeat in 1933, the 12-year-long rule of Nazi terror, the devastation of 6 years of war, the conquest and occupation by the victorious powers, and the infamous partition of Germany by the four powers for purposes of scientifically bleeding it of its economic potency and political viability as a nation, makes it necessary to begin the task of again collecting in class organizations the shattered and dispersed forces of the German proletariat at the most primitive level. Of all the obstacles this task must overcome, the first and the greatest is the military occupation of Germany. Until this condition is ended, the scene will be dominated by the national struggle for liberation. The main slogan around which the German Marxists must orient the struggle in the coming period is, quote, for a unified and independent Germany, end quote. This struggle begins as a struggle for democratic rights against the military authorities of the occupying powers and their Quisling supporters. Freedom of speech, of press, of assembly, of movement, of organization, of communication, and the right to vote, and the demand for a free national assembly will constitute the issues around which the political struggles will revolve and the masses will rally. Unless the German proletarian organizations take upon themselves the lead in this struggle and conduct it in the spirit of socialism and internationalism, this task will fall to the reactionary nationalists. They will utilize it for the reconstruction of the Nazi movement, regardless of the guise of the name under which it will appear. Neither the Social Democrats nor the Stalinists can give the proletariat a lead on this struggle. The former plays the role of adjutant to the Anglo-American authorities, and the latter is the creature of the Russian oppressors. This struggle requires the speediest organization of a revolutionary Marxist party and, in turn, affords our German comrades a clear issue upon which to struggle for such a party. The Marxists of the, quote, victorious, unquote, nations have the special task of defending the democratic rights of the German people by helping, in the first place, to free the land of the imperialist invaders. The unification and liberation of Germany remains the first step toward the restoration of the truncated economy of the continent. In this historical sense, Germany remains the key to Europe. The Marxists of Western Europe must link the struggle against American domination of their own countries with the struggle against the oppression of Germany by their own ruling classes. Such an international proletarian struggle in the defense of the German people will be one of the surest barriers to the reappearance of a Nazi movement in Germany. It will restore to the German proletariat the self-confidence and morale which has been its greatest deficiency since 1933. It will pose before the Stalinist-led workers of Western Europe the, quote, German question, unquote, as a question of international proletarian solidarity, and thereby pose before them the, quote, Russian question, unquote, from the point of view of imperialist oppression. In this respect, the effect of the struggle by the workers of the victorious powers upon the German proletariat is only an aspect of the whole mechanism by which the revolutionary impetus will be given to the German scene, i.e., via the revolutionary struggles of the international proletariat, above all those of Western Europe. The conquest of virtually all of Eastern Europe by Stalinist imperialism has, in the case of Hitler's conquest, burdened the masses with a combination of class exploitation and national oppression. In these countries, especially, the slogan of the, quote, defense of the Soviet Union, unquote, can be nothing but a cover for the rapacity of Stalinist imperialism. The revolutionary Marxists are no less firmly committed to support of the demand for national liberation from the yoke of Stalinism than from the yoke of Hitlerism or any other form of imperialist subjugation and violation of the right of self-determination and self-rule. The Fourth International must adopt and propagate the slogan of national liberation for the peoples and nations oppressed by Stalinist Russia as an elementary internationalist duty, as an indispensable part of the internationalist education of the whole working class. As in the case of the movements which arose against German imperialism, the Workers' Party will support every socialist or genuinely popular democratic movement of resistance against the imperialist oppressor in Eastern Europe, without giving any aid or support to reactionary landlord or capitalist fascist elements who seek to... Yeah. I don't know.
You need to get in the shower?
No, I'm good.
Close the window.
That's fine.
Everything's going to be closed up except the kitchen, right?
All right, cool.
I mean, if you want to open it again, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm not going to be here. We're not going to be here.
Okay. The Fourth International must adopt and propagate the slogan of national liberation for the peoples and nations oppressed by Stalinist Russia as an elementary internationalist duty and as an indispensable part of the internationalist education of the whole working class. As in the case of the movements which arose against German imperialism, the Workers' Party will support every socialist or genuinely popular democratic movement of resistance against the imperialist oppressor in Eastern Europe, without giving any aid or support to reactionary landlord or capitalist fascist elements who seek to exploit the progressive national sentiments of the masses. However, we do not take the Stalinist word for it that all the partisans and partisan bands in Poland, for example, who are fighting against the invading oppressor or against the totalitarian, quote, native, end quote, regime are, quote, fascist, end quote. We are only too well aware of the Stalinist practice of labeling all its opponents as, quote, fascist, end quote. The struggle for national liberation is inseparably bound up in these countries with the fight for all democratic rights and liberties, including the right to free universal suffrage and a free constituent assembly. The attempt to substitute for this slogan the slogan of, quote, Soviets, end quote, is false and preposterous. In countries like Poland, etc., there is no tradition whatsoever of the revolutionary Soviets established by the Bolshevik Revolution. What has appeared to these people in the name of, quote, Sovietism, end quote, is the Stalinist reaction, which they abhor and against which they are already striving with all their force. As in the case of Western Europe under the Nazi occupation, our support of the struggle for national freedom is not support for the return or restoration to power of the landlords and capitalists. Our demand for the Constituent Assembly is closely linked with the demand for the preservation of nationalized economy under democratic control, with the demand for the land to the peasants, but free from the police rule of the GPU satrapy. The attempts of the Stalinist imperialists to consolidate their power and control in Eastern Europe cannot but lead to increased resistance of the masses. This resistance must inevitably take the form of struggle for ousting the invader and establishing the national sovereignty of the occupied lands. The masses of the conquered countries show, as they did during the war, both the organic need and organic capacity to oust the invader. Wherever the masses have had any opportunity to express themselves, they have manifested their hostility to the Stalinist, Austrian and Hungarian elections, mass demonstrations in Romania, semi-civil war in Poland. Failure to give staunch support to the movement for national freedom from Stalinist rule, both in the newly occupied countries as well as in those countries of the, quote, Soviet Union, end quote, long ago usurped by the Kremlin autocracy, can only serve, moreover, to delay the inevitable crisis of Stalinism in Russia itself, to preserve itself, to enhance its power and privilege, to maintain its exploitation and oppression of peoples and nations annexed to the Russian Empire. The bureaucracy is compelled to saddle the Russian masses with an ever vaster bureaucratic monster, with an even vaster police and spy force, with a huge standing army, all of which are directed against the Russian people as well. The bureaucracy is compelled, like the ruling class of the capitalist empires, to deprive the masses of homes and a decent standard of living by concentrating upon preparation for imperialist war and upon production of the means of destruction. The returning soldiers who have seen other lands under circumstances which puts the Stalinist regime in a truer, that is, a less advantageous light, can only add to the restlessness and dissatisfaction which Stalinism generates among the people. The rise of the most brutal chauvinism in the upper ranks of the bureaucracy, especially the military bureaucracy, must clash with the war weariness and yearning for peace and security of the people. The crisis of Stalinism cannot be too long postponed. It can weather this crisis if the Russian people feel themselves isolated. Their true ally in the struggle for emancipation is not the Stalinist bureaucracy, but the peoples of the oppressed nations who are fighting for national freedom against this bureaucracy. The overturn of the Stalinist ruling class in Russia is now the common direct task of the Russian masses and nations under Russian heel.